I never thought that silence could sound like betrayal. But there I was, sitting in my own kitchen, staring at the oncology envelope that could rewrite the rest of my life. And nobody noticed, not one of them. Through the thin wall between the kitchen and the living room, I could hear my grown children laughing, cracking jokes over a television show I didn't recognize. Their laughter bounced through the house like ghosts of a family I used to know. And yet, none of them had asked how my doctor's appointment went. Not even once. I stared at the envelope. My hands weren't trembling, yet, but my stomach was a knot of dread and resentment. "Marianne, you worry too much," they always said. "It's probably nothing." That's what my son muttered when I mentioned the lump. That's what my daughter-in-law dismissed while handing me her toddler and heading out for drinks. But this envelope wasn't nothing. I had gone to the hospital alone, took the early bus, wore a cardigan with moth holes because it was the only clean thing they hadn't packed into a donation box without asking. I sat in the waiting room for over an hour, clutching a used tissue and watching young couples cradle newborns while I waited to be told if I would see next spring. The doctor was kind, almost too kind. He kept his voice level, his words clinical. "We'll know more after additional scans, but based on your symptoms and the imaging." He hesitated. "It looks like stage 3. I thanked him like a fool, like he'd just told me I'd won a prize. Then I took the bus home with the envelope sealed, unopened, clutched so tight my knuckles turned white. Now I sat at the kitchen table, lights off, the day's shadows stretching long across the floor. I waited for someone, anyone, to notice, to ask, to care. But the TV was too loud, the baby too fussy, the fridge too full of groceries I hadn't bought but was expected to cook. I watched the hallway, hoping maybe my son would glance into the kitchen. He didn't. They moved into my house last year, said it was to help. I gave up my bedroom so the grandkids could sleep comfortably. I slept in the sewing room on a cot that creaked every time I turned over. But today, I didn't care about the cot, or the aching in my back. I cared that nobody noticed I was breaking. I pressed the envelope to my chest. My heart wasn't beating fast anymore. It was just heavy, numb. And in that quiet moment, the coldest thought I'd ever had settled into my bones. They wouldn't even notice if I died tonight. Not until breakfast was late. I stood up, walked to the trash can, and lifted the lid, hovered the envelope over it, then stopped. No. I walked back to the table and tucked the envelope under the placemat instead. Let them wonder someday. Let them search this kitchen in panic after I'm gone and find it, unopened, stained with tea and grief. Let them read what they ignored when it mattered. Because tonight was the night I stopped begging to be seen. The day after the envelope, I woke up to the sound of my granddaughter wailing over spilled juice. I rolled off the cot in the sewing room, my room now, apparently, and limped to the kitchen. No one had noticed I hadn't come to bed last night. I'd fallen asleep sitting up, envelope still under the placemat, heart still cracked open. The house was full of life, but none of it mine. My son's voice barked from the hallway. "Mom, can you get her changed? Sarah's running late." "No, good morning. No, how are you feeling today, Mom?" "Just orders." I found the little one sticky and red-faced, crying over her ruined pajamas. I picked her up, kissed her hair and whispered, "It's okay, baby. Grandma's got you." Sarah, my daughter-in-law, breezed past with a to-go coffee, heels clicking like gunshots on the hardwood. She didn't even glance at me. "I left a list on the fridge," she said. "Groceries. Oh, and we're out of diapers." Then she was gone. My son was sitting at the table, glued to his phone. "And can you take the van for an oil change? The light came on yesterday." I wanted to scream, "This is my house." But I said nothing, because if I did, he'd raise his eyebrows like I was being dramatic. Sarah would sigh that tight-lipped sigh and mutter, "She's getting worse, you know. Forgetful." Lately, they'd been tossing around words like early signs, like mental decline, as if forgetting where I put the remote meant I was fading away. They made jokes at dinner. Lighthearted, they called it. Careful, Grandma might put salt in the coffee again. And everyone would laugh. Even the kids. It was never funny to me. It was humiliating. I cooked, I cleaned, I picked up their kids from daycare. When their work meetings ran late, I made sure Sarah had her gluten-free snacks, and my son's work shirts were pressed. But still, I was the one they whispered about when I went to bed. The slow one. The forgetful one. I looked around the kitchen, once mine. The magnets on the fridge had changed. The rugs replaced with cheap plastic mats. Even my favorite ceramic spoon rest had been pushed to the back of a drawer. There were tiny signs everywhere that I was no longer the center here. Just a ghost with a sponge and a casserole dish. My friends used to come by once a week. We'd drink tea, gossip, laugh about old boyfriends and burnt pies. They stopped after Sarah complained about too much noise when the baby naps. The house got quieter after that. Too quiet. Except for the voices that didn't stop, the ones that reminded me of who I used to be. Before they moved in, I was independent. I had routines, friends, peace. Now I was their unpaid help, a convenient caretaker, a woman whose name was replaced with Grandma, Mom, her. Never Marianne. Never me. After I'd done the dishes and folded 2 baskets of laundry, I sat in the garage with the engine running. Not to end anything, but to think, to breathe. It was the only place I could go where no one asked for anything. I turned the engine off and stared at the wall for what felt like an hour. Something inside me shifted that day, not loudly, not dramatically, just tilted, like furniture settling unevenly after years of standing still. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to get away with this forever. Later that week, I found myself in the garden. It was the only part of the house that still felt like it belonged to me. The rosemary had grown wild, curling over the stone edges like it remembered when I used to tend it every morning. The jasmine was choking the fence, blossoms dropping like forgotten confetti. I plucked a few dried blooms between my fingers, inhaled the scent, and for 1 second, I was 26 again, laughing over lemon cake with my neighbor Joyce, sun in our eyes, our babies sleeping in their strollers nearby. We had been young then, not rich, not lucky, just alive. There had been dinner parties, loud music on weekends, birthdays with homemade banners, and friends who came by just because. My husband had still been alive, and while he wasn't perfect, he'd never made me beg for dignity. Back then, no one called me forgetful. I bent down and pulled a weed from the corner by the fence. The soil was dry. They hadn't watered it in weeks. The garden, like me, was still here, just no longer seen. Through the open kitchen window, I heard them talking. Sarah was on the phone. Her voice dropped low, but not low enough. I don't know how much longer she's staying. She's basically just here. A pause. Then a quiet laugh. Yeah, I mean, it's like having a guest who overstayed her welcome. She giggled again, soft and cruel. She keeps reorganizing the pantry like it's still her house. I froze. Guest. That word. It hit like a slap I didn't see coming. I dug my fingers into the dirt, the pain in my knuckles anchoring me. A guest. In my own home. The house I paid off in tears and double shifts. The one with my name on the deed, where my children learned to walk, where my husband took his last breath holding my hand. She called me a guest. And the worst part? My son didn't correct her. He just murmured something like, "She means well," as if I were some pitiful charity case. I sat back on my heels and stared at the garden. Every inch of this house had my fingerprints. Every memory clung to the walls like dust. And yet, somehow, I had become the afterthought. They planned vacations without me, made decisions while I was washing dishes, called me helpful, like a dog who fetched the newspaper but wasn't allowed on the couch. Maybe it was easier for them to see me that way. If I wasn't a person with needs and thoughts, then they didn't have to feel guilty for ignoring me. I walked back inside, hands stained with soil, and past my daughter-in-law in the hallway. She didn't even glance at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the edge of the cot, looking at the faded photo of my wedding day tucked into the mirror frame. I whispered into the dark, not knowing who I was speaking to. Am I really invisible now? No one answered. The next evening, I locked the bathroom door and sat on the edge of the tub, the envelope in my hands. Stage 3. I read it once. Then again. My eyes didn't blur, not even from tears. Just stillness. As if my body knew before my mind did. As if some deep part of me had already made peace with it. There was no timeline in the letter. No guarantees. Just words like aggressive, treatment urgency, and further consultation. But I didn't need a calendar to understand what it meant. I'd spent years watching my friends get diagnosed, then disappear. The whispers, the sympathy meals, the empty chairs at garden club. But what chilled me wasn't the diagnosis. It was how quiet the house was as I held it. The living room buzzed with laughter. My son was retelling some story about work. Sarah was laughing too hard, probably at her own joke. Their oldest was on a tablet, the baby crying in intervals. Not once did anyone knock. No one asked why I'd been in the bathroom for 20 minutes. No one noticed. That's what gutted me the most. I could be dying. I was dying. And no one cared enough to ask how my appointment went. At dinner, I served them roast chicken, carrots, garlic mashed potatoes, the kind of comfort meal I used to make on birthdays. No one asked why I cooked such a nice dinner on a random Thursday. They just ate, complimented the seasoning, and left their plates in the sink. I sat across from them, watching my granddaughter smush peas into her plate while Sarah scrolled her phone. I wondered what they would say if I collapsed right then and there. If my heart just gave out and I fell forward into the potatoes. Would Sarah scream? Would my son try CPR? Or would they just tell the kids to go upstairs and call 911 with the same tone they used to order takeout? It wasn't drama that filled me. It was truth. Cold, aching truth. I realized something between the salad and the soft rolls. If I didn't tell them, they would never know. And even if I did, what would they say? Oh no, Mom, we didn't mean to ignore you. Don't worry, we'll take care of you. Take care of me? The way I took care of them while they bitched about my slow steps and my memory? The way Sarah joked about putting me in one of those homes every time I misplaced my reading glasses? No, I wouldn't give them that chance. I looked at each of their faces that night, not searching for love. There was none left to find, but memorizing their indifference. I wanted to remember it, hold it inside like flint and steel, because something in me had gone hard. Not bitter, not cold, just certain. Later, I went out to the garden with a glass of wine and watched the moon rise above the jasmine. I felt its light on my face, and for a moment, I let myself grieve, not the cancer, not the lost health, but the fact that I had loved them so unconditionally, and they didn't even see me enough to ask how my doctor's appointment went. That was the death that hurt more, not my body, my place in this family. The wind was cool, brushing across my face like a secret only I would carry. I looked up and whispered to the stars, I'm not going to die here, not under this roof, not as their servant. 3 days later, I walked into the hospice center with a basket of hand-knit scarves and a lie on my tongue. I'm here to donate, I said to the woman at the front desk, my voice steady but unfamiliar in my own ears. Just wanted to give these to anyone who could use them. She smiled like I had brought sunshine in with me. That's very kind of you, Ms. Marianne, I replied. She didn't ask for a last name. She didn't glance at a chart. She didn't tilt her head and whisper about forgetfulness. Instead, she stood up and took the basket like it mattered. Like I mattered. A volunteer offered me tea. Another brought out 2 residents. A woman in her 60s with shaky hands and a man humming softly to himself. I sat beside them for over an hour, sipping lukewarm peppermint tea and listening to their stories. No one asked if I had grandkids. No one questioned why I was there. It felt respectful, simple and quiet, the kind of atmosphere where people didn't speak over one another just to be heard. I watched the staff gently adjust pillows, Bring warm towels. Ask questions with tenderness instead of time limits. One nurse patted the hand of a woman who couldn't respond anymore, her eyes cloudy and mouth slack. She whispered, "Still beautiful," before tucking the blanket around her shoulders. I had never seen anything so dignified. It made me ache, not from jealousy, but from the sudden, jarring realization that strangers could offer what my own family had withheld for years: recognition, presence, care without condition. As I walked back to my car, I sat behind the wheel for a while, keys idle in my hand. The parking lot was quiet, shaded by an old oak tree. A few yellow leaves drifted across the windshield, and I watched them fall like it was the first time I'd seen autumn. There was no panic, no sobbing, just something deep and certain whispering in my chest. You could die here, and it would be okay. Not because I was resigned to death, but because in that hospice, for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like a person again. Driving home was harder than arriving. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I could feel the weight return. The house loomed with its chipped paint and echoes of contempt. Sarah's voice rang out as I opened the door. "Oh, thank God, Mom. The baby's been impossible all morning. Can you?" I didn't even hear the rest. I nodded, handed her the diapers I'd picked up, and went straight to the sewing room. That night, while folding towels, I took inventory of what I could part with. The heirloom brooches Sarah eyed during holidays. The pearl earrings my son assumed he'd sell when I passed. Even the silver tea set no one but me ever used. They all had value. More value than the people waiting to take them. The next day, I made my first trip to the appraisal center. The man behind the counter looked surprised as I laid the items out, one at a time, carefully. He didn't ask why. He just gave me numbers. Real ones. Ones that made my breath catch, not with greed, but with possibility. As I walked out with a check in my purse, something strange and fierce lit in my chest. They would never see it coming. They didn't even see me. It started with the pearl ring, the one Sarah had admired so many times, running her fingers along the gold band like it was already hers. I slid it into a velvet pouch and placed it in the back of my sock drawer, behind the heating pad and the expired painkillers they never bothered to replace. I sold it the next morning. The jeweler gave me a fair price. He even complimented the setting. I didn't tell him it was my mother's. I didn't tell him that my son once said, "Don't worry, we'll keep all your nice pieces in the family." What he meant was, "We'll keep the things we want." What I meant now was, over my body. And that was the point, wasn't it? They all thought I was dying. And maybe I was, but not fast enough for their liking. The second piece I sold was my husband's old watch. He'd left it to me with a little note in the box. "For when you need to know what time it is." I think he meant it literally. I think he also meant it the way I read it now, when it's time to go. I didn't sell everything at once. That would have made noise. No, I let the days pass with the usual rituals: school pickup, grocery runs, quiet dinners where I served food none of them thanked me for. But while they watched TV, I wrote letters. To each of them. Not spiteful ones. Not yet. Just truths. To my son, "You used to hold my hand at the supermarket and beg me for candy. Now you don't even look up when I speak." To Sarah, "I once believed you wanted to be part of this family, but you wanted the house, not the history." To my granddaughter, "You're the only one who sees me. I pray that never changes." I folded the letters and sealed them, dated them, hid them in the closet behind the Christmas decorations, the ones nobody else ever touched because they weren't modern enough. I also started keeping a notebook, a log of everything they said. The casual cruelty, the things they denied ever saying later. Why is she always so dramatic? She's getting slower every week. I swear it's like living with a toddler. I don't think she should be driving anymore. What if she hurts one of the kids? I wrote it all down, word for word. If they ever questioned why I did what I was going to do, I wanted it documented. At night, when they were asleep, I sat by the small lamp on my sewing table and stared at my will. The original one, drafted when my husband died, left everything to my son. I had trusted him then, believed he would care for the home, for me, for our family. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who forgot to ask if his mother was okay after a hospital visit. So I made an appointment. The lawyer didn't flinch when I told him what I wanted. I want to leave everything to the hospice and a few local charities, and a savings bond for my granddaughter, something she can't touch until she's old enough to know who I really was. He nodded, took notes, asked questions. At the end, he looked up and said, "Are you sure?" I nodded. They love what I own, not who I am. As I walked out of the office, I passed a mirror in the hallway. I stopped. My face looked the same. Older, yes, but not broken, not bitter. Just finally, mine again. They had no idea I was preparing to leave. Not just the house, but them. The final version of the will arrived by courier, folded neatly inside a plain manila envelope. I didn't rush to open it. I already knew what it said. I'd read the draft 3 times at the lawyer's office, tracing every line with my fingertip like it was a road map out of hell. Still, when I unfolded it at the kitchen table that night, I felt something shift. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even revenge. It was closure. I had erased their names, not out of spite, out of mercy, because they would never stop seeing me as a wallet with wrinkles unless I stopped letting them. The house? It now belonged to a local hospice foundation, with a clause allowing me to reside in it until I passed. After that, they'd sell it to fund care for patients like me, people who deserve dignity. The rest, what little savings I had left, some modest stocks, and a few heirlooms, I divided between the hospice, a food bank, and the town's battered women's shelter, because if anyone knew what it felt like to be invisible, it was them. I left my granddaughter a bond she wouldn't even know about until her 25th birthday. With it, a letter sealed in an envelope marked, "When you're old enough to understand why love isn't the same as loyalty." As I tucked the will into my filing cabinet under M, I half expected someone to burst through the door and demand to know what I was doing. But no one noticed. My son was arguing over which Netflix show to watch. Sarah was texting her sister about some vacation they hadn't invited me on. The children were screaming, but no one was listening, not even to each other. I watched them from the hallway for a moment. A family molded out of noise and assumption, never once stopping to ask how the matriarch felt because they didn't think one existed anymore. They assumed the world turned because they asked it to. That night, I moved my jewelry box to the back of the closet and replaced it with a plastic one filled with costume pieces. Let them think they were preparing for inheritance. Let them polish stones that would never sparkle. The days blurred after that. Quiet movements, subtle changes. I sold the antique dishes one plate at a time, hiding the cash in old pill bottles labeled for blood pressure. I stopped going to the grocery store with lists they handed me and bought only what I wanted. When they complained, I shrugged. I forgot. They rolled their eyes and whispered about my decline. Let them. The less they noticed me, the freer I became. One night, as I folded laundry no one thanked me for, I heard Sarah's voice again. "She's just fading. Honestly, I think we'll get the house sooner than we thought." They thought they were being quiet, but the walls in this house, like me, had been through storms. They carried sound in their bones. I stood in the hallway, clutching a towel, and stared into the room where they all sat. I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt relief. I had been the backbone, the housekeeper, the free babysitter, the woman who gave up a name for a role. And now, quietly, I had taken it all back. They thought I was sleeping most nights, resting, withering, but I wasn't. I was writing goodbye letters in blue ink, arranging final appointments, laughing quietly to myself every time they argued over a remote control while I erased them line by line from the future. They didn't know they were already ghosts in my story. And soon, I would be the one who vanished without a sound. It was a Sunday afternoon, warm and sticky. One of those lazy days where the hours stretch out thin, filled with chores nobody wants to do and silence too thick to ignore. I was folding towels in the laundry room when I heard it. The baby monitor crackled. Sarah had left it on, probably forgot to switch it off after putting the toddler down for a nap. Their voices came through faint but clear. My granddaughter and Sarah. "Mommy," the little one said, her voice soft. "Is Grandma gonna die soon?" I froze. There was no hesitation in her tone. No fear, no sadness. Just a curious, casual question from a child who had been listening too closely. Sarah didn't rush to correct her. She didn't gasp or say, "Don't talk like that." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I think so, sweetie," she said quietly. "Maybe not right away, but soon. That's why we need to be patient, okay? Then I can have her room?" I didn't drop the towel. I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding it like a flag of surrender I was never going to wave again. Sarah chuckled. "Maybe. We'll see." I turned off the monitor. It wasn't rage I felt. That would have been too generous. Rage requires investment, passion, hope. What I felt was confirmation. They weren't waiting for me to recover. They were waiting for me to disappear. I sat down on the laundry bench, my knees trembling beneath me. The towels smelled of lavender, clean and soft. I had always liked laundry. Folding it gave me a sense of order, a kind of quiet comfort in a chaotic world. Even now, I reached for another one, smoothing it out on my lap like muscle memory. I remembered holding that same granddaughter in my arms the day she was born. Sarah had been groggy, exhausted from the delivery. My son was pacing the hallway with a nervous grin, and I had held that tiny baby close and whispered, "You are loved. You will always be loved." But even love like that, given without condition, doesn't guarantee anything. Children hear everything. They absorb what they see. And she had seen me, over and over again, being treated like I didn't matter. So of course she thought it was normal. Of course she thought my death meant a room she could repaint. It wasn't her fault. Not really. But it sealed something in me. That night, I sat at my sewing table and wrote her letter. Not the one I'd sealed with the bond for her 25th birthday. This one was different. Raw, honest. I told her about who I had been before I was grandma, about the dreams I gave up, the friends I lost touch with, about the way her mother looked at me like I was in the way, about the silence from her father, and the pain of loving a child who no longer looked you in the eye. I told her I hoped she would grow up to be better, kinder, stronger. I told her I forgave her. Then I folded the letter, sealed it, and labeled it. If she ever asks who I really was, they wouldn't find it until much later. Maybe after I was gone. Maybe when they finally cleared out my things and found the stack of letters I'd hidden behind the family albums they never looked at. But it didn't matter when, because they would find them. And maybe, just maybe, they'd realize that I was never invisible. They just refused to look. The house was still asleep when I zipped the suitcase closed. Not that I had much to pack, just a few changes of clothes, a book I hadn't finished since last Christmas, and the framed photo of my wedding day that I'd tucked behind the dresser after they redecorated without asking. I didn't take anything they'd notice missing. No silverware, no jewelry. I wanted no accusations of theft, only silence, absence. That would sting more. The hospice had sent a volunteer. Linda, kind eyes, steady hands, the type of woman who could help you carry not just bags, but fear. She waited in the driveway with the engine running, headlights off. I glanced back one last time. The living room was dark, save for the blue glow of a forgotten TV. The toys I had picked up just hours earlier were scattered again. My folded laundry had already been pulled apart. Someone looking for their favorite shirt, no doubt. I passed the hallway slowly, pausing for a moment outside my son's door. I could hear him snoring. Sarah, too. Not a peaceful kind of sleep, but the kind you earn from spending the day making decisions you'll never have to live with. I wanted to say goodbye. I really did. But they didn't deserve it. Not after everything. Not after hearing their daughter ask when I'd die so she could take my room, and watching Sarah agree with a shrug. I left the letters in the desk drawer, clearly labeled. They'd find them when the silence grew loud enough to investigate. In the kitchen, I taped a note to the fridge. Just 2 lines. "Don't look for me. I'm where people remember I'm still alive." And with that, I stepped out the front door and didn't look back. The sun hadn't risen yet. The sky was painted in dark blues and soft purples, like the world was holding its breath for what came next. Linda helped me into the car. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a thermos of tea and said, "We'll get you settled." The drive was quiet. The streets were empty, but my mind buzzed louder than it had in months. Every bump in the road rattled the years I'd spent holding that family together like duct tape over a sinking boat. I had been everything to them: cook, cleaner, babysitter, silent punching bag. They hadn't even noticed when I started disappearing piece by piece. But they would now. They'd wake up to a house that no longer functioned. Breakfast wouldn't be made. The towels wouldn't be folded. The appointments wouldn't be scheduled. And for the first time in their lives, they'd have to ask, "Where is she?" I hoped they sat in that kitchen and read that note 10 times over, searching it for answers they'd ignored when I was still trying to give them. At the hospice, I was greeted like a guest, not an obligation. A nurse showed me my room, small, clean, with a window facing the courtyard. There were flowers on the bedside table. A real bed. A soft quilt that wasn't frayed by years of secondhand living. I sat down and let myself breathe. It was the first breath I'd taken that didn't feel like a chore. Linda placed my suitcase by the dresser and said, "Take your time. This place moves at your pace now." I nodded, fighting the lump in my throat. Because for the first time in years, no one needed anything from me. And that was everything. There was no schedule at the hospice. No alarms blaring at 6 a.m. demanding breakfast. No frantic voices asking where someone's socks had gone. No passive-aggressive sighs over unfolded laundry. Just the quiet shuffle of nurses, the murmur of kind conversations, and the distant sound of birds outside my window. I hadn't realized how much I'd forgotten how silence could be comforting. At first, I didn't know what to do with myself. My hands twitched for things to clean. I found myself instinctively scanning the room for clutter, expecting messes that weren't mine to fix. But there were none. They told me I didn't have to do anything unless I wanted to. I hadn't heard that in over a decade. So I did something small. I painted. There had been an art room at the hospice, a sunlit corner with brushes, canvases, and cheap acrylics, the kind you'd find in a school supply aisle, all bright and imprecise. It had been decades since I held a paintbrush, but when I dipped that brush into yellow, then blue, something opened. Not perfectly, not gracefully. My first painting was terrible. A garden that looked like a bruise, but it was mine. And when I hung it by my bed, no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. The nurse just smiled and said, "It's lovely, Marianne. You captured something in the sky." No one had said my name like that in months. Not Grandma, not Mom, not the curt, annoyed version of Marianne that Sarah used when she was trying to sound respectful in front of strangers. Just Marianne. I had almost forgotten I was still in there. Within a week, I had 5 more paintings. One of a flower that never bloomed. One of a mountain with no path up. One of a little girl with her back turned, watching a fire in the distance. They were messy. Raw. Honest. Sometimes I caught myself crying while I painted. Not from sadness exactly, but from recognition. I was finally seeing parts of myself I'd hidden away for so long just to survive. The hospice staff didn't hover. They didn't watch me like I might slip or forget or ruin their schedule. They asked how I felt, not what I could do for them, not what I had cooked, not if I remembered to grab milk. I met another woman there, Grace, a widow with sharp eyes and soft words. We sat on the porch together, talking about nothing and everything. She told me how her kids stopped calling after her diagnosis. I told her how mine never really started. We didn't need to explain. We understood each other in the spaces between sentences. One afternoon, as we watched a robin hop across the railing, she said something I'll never forget. "They only loved the version of you that served them. That's not love. That's convenience." I nodded, my throat tight, because deep down, I had always known. All those years, I thought if I kept giving, if I loved hard enough, patiently enough, they'd finally give back. But love that demands you disappear isn't love, it's theft. And I was done being robbed. At the hospice, I wasn't a guest or a burden. I was just a woman with stage 3 cancer who still wanted to paint and drink lukewarm tea and laugh at bad TV with someone who didn't see her as a chore. For the first time in years, I felt like my own again. Not useful, not invisible, whole. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it finally clicked. Not with drama, not with fanfare. Just me, sitting in the sunroom, watching the light spill across the floor, realizing a truth I had been avoiding my whole life. They never loved me. Not the way I loved them. Not the kind of love that notices when someone's eyes are dimmer, or their hands tremble. Not the love that remembers birthdays without Facebook reminders. Not the love that asks, "Are you okay?" and actually listens. What they gave me was performance, conditional affection, love with price tags and fine print. I thought back to when I first got sick, how I came home from the doctor's office with hands shaking and a heart too loud in my chest, and no one even asked if I wanted tea. No one asked anything. They called me dramatic, slow, said things like, "Mom's always tired these days," with an eye roll like I was exaggerating for attention. I had been trying to hold them together while I was falling apart, and they didn't even notice. That's when I saw it clearly. The currency of our family had always been what I could provide. When I had meals ready, laundry folded, children soothed, I was the rock. When I started asking for a little space, a little care, suddenly I was confused, irritable, difficult. The camera lens blinked back at me like an unblinking eye. It sat on the little wooden table in the hospice library, a space that smelled of paper and lemon polish, where no one interrupted and time slowed to match the breath of those running out of it. I pressed record. "Hello, Michael." My voice trembled, just a little. But I didn't stop. "If you're watching this, I'm gone. And no, this isn't a guilt trip. It's a gift. I'm giving you something I never gave you while I was alive. The full truth." I took a breath. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the pause. "When you were born, I thought love meant sacrifice, that I could endure anything as long as you were happy. I gave you everything, my sleep, my strength, my savings. And for a while, I told myself that was enough, that your comfort was my reward." The tremble was gone now. My voice, finally, was my own. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me, not just as a mother, but as a person. I became your convenience, your default babysitter, your in-house maid, and I let it happen. That's on me. I leaned forward slightly. When I got sick, you didn't notice. You didn't ask. And when you finally found out, I suspect your first thought wasn't, "Is she okay?" It was, "What will this cost us?" I paused again, not for drama, for memory. You let Sarah laugh at me. You let your daughter talk about my death like a furniture reshuffle. You watched me fold your shirts with shaking hands and called me forgetful instead of fragile. There was no venom in my voice, only clarity. And yet, this isn't a letter of hate. It's a mirror. I want you to look into it and ask yourself if this is who you wanted to become. I ended the message with a quiet, "Goodbye, my son," and stopped the recording. I did the same for Sarah. No screaming, no name-calling, just calm confrontation. You wanted my house, not my presence. You saw my aging as a burden, not a legacy. And one day, when your children grow tired of you, I hope you remember the way you looked past me like I was already dead. Her message was shorter, but it would cut deeper. For my granddaughter, I recorded something else entirely. "Sweetheart, if you're watching this, you're old enough to start questioning the stories you've been told. I want you to know that Grandma was once brave, once full of dreams, and she never stopped loving you, even when the house got cold." I smiled for her, even cried a little. Then I handed the flash drive to the hospice director, a woman with gentle eyes who had asked no questions when I said, "I'd like these delivered after I pass." She nodded solemnly. "It will be done, exactly as you wish." Walking out of that library, I felt lighter. They would never understand the depth of what they had, until it was too late. But that's what happens when people assume you'll always be there. And when I wasn't, they'd have my voice, not to haunt them, to wake them. I passed the garden on my way back to my room. The flowers I'd helped plant with Grace were blooming now, wild and imperfect, reaching for the sun with no one to prune them into boxes. Just like me, I stopped and whispered to them, soon. Soon, they'd hear what I never had the space to say. And they would sit in the silence I left behind, realizing it wasn't my death that hollowed the house. It was their indifference that emptied it long before I ever left. It took one signature to change everything. Not emotionally, of course. Emotionally, I had been rewriting this ending for months, packing my dignity piece by piece, sealing my resentment in manila envelopes and quiet resolve. But legally? It only took ink. I sat across from the lawyer, a kind-eyed woman named Eliza, who didn't flinch when I handed her the house deed. "It's fully in your name," she confirmed, scrolling through the documents. "No liens, no co-signers. That's rare." I smiled, tight-lipped. "Rare, yes, but necessary." She raised an eyebrow when I explained what I wanted. A clean sale. Mortgage to a trusted buyer I had selected through the hospice's real estate contact. A woman whose parents once lived there, who had always dreamed of raising her own family in a place with history. "I want a delayed move-in clause," I told Eliza, 60 days after my death, no sooner. Eviction notices to be delivered then. "Your family won't see it coming," she said gently. "They never saw me," I replied. That afternoon, the papers were signed. I walked out of that office with my purse a little heavier, my shoulders a little straighter, and my heart, still damaged, still fragile, finally held in my own hands again. The buyer would remain anonymous to my family. Her lawyer would handle everything: final sale, transition, and notices. It was tidy, invisible, exactly how they had treated me all those years. Back at the hospice, I celebrated alone. I sat on the porch with Grace and clinked plastic cups of ginger ale. "To freedom," she whispered. "To invisibility," I murmured back, the most powerful weapon they gave me. They never saw the signs, never questioned the sudden influx of groceries I paid for myself, never noticed I stopped asking for anything. Not one of them suspected the home they lived in, the one they fought over like greedy heirs at a funeral, was already spoken for. They thought I was fading. But I was finalizing. My son had once joked, "One day this place will be ours, babe," while Sarah measured the dining room for a modern table she thought I couldn't hear her fantasize about. I heard it all. I never forgot. And now they would learn the same way I did, through silence, through paperwork, through the absence of mercy where they once assumed inheritance. I left no trail to question, no bank records in their name, no assets they could claim. The eviction notices were scheduled, each one set to arrive precisely 60 days after the recorded date of my passing. By then, the hospice would have sent out the flash drives. The house would no longer be theirs. They would return from the post-funeral haze to find strangers at the door with legal documents and no room for argument. And when they said, "But it was ours," the new owner would simply shake her head. No, it never was. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Not because I was vindictive. Not because I wanted revenge. Because justice, when done right, doesn't scream. It whispers through deeds and signatures and certified letters. It walks quietly, confidently, through the hallways they once claimed and switches off the lights behind it. They found out from an email, not a phone call. Not a gentle, "We're so sorry to inform you." Just a blunt, automated notification, property transfer completed. Occupants to vacate by August 1st. Contact your legal representative for transition protocols. My son called the hospice an hour later, frantic. The receptionist handed the call to the director, who calmly confirmed that yes, Marianne had passed 2 days earlier. That yes, arrangements had been made. That no, visitors were not permitted unless specified in writing by the patient beforehand. She didn't leave a list, the director said. "I'm sorry." They drove down that same afternoon. Sarah didn't even wait until the car stopped before storming into the front office. She was red-faced, clutching her phone like it owed her an apology. This has to be a mistake. We're her family. The director looked up with the kind of practiced calm only hospice staff develop, the kind that's seen too many deaths and too few goodbyes. "I understand," she said softly. "But Marianne requested no visitors." "No visitors?" my son echoed, stunned. "We're her children." "Exactly," the director said, her smile gentle but immovable. "She said if you ever came, we were to remind you, being related doesn't make you family." They stood there, stunned. And that's when the staff brought out the small box, black, padded, with 2 flash drives inside, each labeled in my handwriting. One for my son, one for Sarah. No explanations. Just, "Please watch alone." The hospice director didn't need to say anything else. They knew. They left without seeing me, without even being allowed near my room. Later, I heard from Grace. She had watched it all from the courtyard. "Your son looked like he'd been punched in the throat," she said. "And your daughter-in-law?" she cried. "Not because she missed you, because she knew she'd lost." I imagined it all, the silence in the car, the click of the flash drive, the moment my voice filled the room with truths they could no longer deny. I imagined Sarah's tear-streaked face as I said, "You looked past me so often you forgot I could see you." I imagined my son going pale as I whispered, "You loved my money more than you loved me." I imagined their house growing colder by the minute as realization sunk in that everything they counted on, ownership, inheritance, control, was gone. And I wasn't there to comfort them. I wasn't there to rescue them from their own apathy. They drove back to the house in silence, I'm sure, parked in the driveway like squatters in someone else's dream, and found, taped to the inside of the mailbox, the final blow. Eviction effective August 1st. Failure to vacate will result in legal proceedings. Typed. Unsentimental, binding. They didn't know where to go. They didn't have backup plans. They never thought they'd need one, because they thought I'd never leave. They thought I'd die quietly and leave everything behind. They were wrong. I left nothing for them to misuse. No house to fight over. No jewelry to appraise. No letters begging for reconciliation. Only my voice. Calm, final, and the locked door of a hospice they were never invited to enter.